On the one hand, I'm glad that we have a small oilam. What does it mean? There used to be a Yiddish saying, "Was kleiner der oilam is größer die simcha." I'll translate. The smaller the group, the greater the joy. But today it's going to be a lot more in what in Yiddish you would say, "Medav halten kol." You have to stay with the idea, because I'm not only talking to you. As a sentence goes in the Bible, "Et asher yeshno po, veit asher eneno po." I'm talking to the people who are here, and I'm talking to the people who are not here at this moment. Because the issues that have come up for people in Jewish renewal about this thing that deals with Psycho-Halakhah is a big problem. Some people have thought that when you get involved in Jewish renewal, that this sort of Judaism light, doesn't have too many calories, it won't hurt you, you won't get fat from it, and so on. The truth is that since we have undergone a paradigm shift, we are dealing with situations that demand a different way of assessing. Now, most of the time when we spoke about halacha, it meant for us obligation. That's to say, halacha was something to bind us. All you needed to say, this is the halacha. And people would recognize that they were involved in that. And a deviation from that was a situation that was sinful. Then come shifts as they happened before, when we offered sacrifices in the temple. And now, I can't imagine anybody getting high on Pesach, eating of the lamb that was in his house for a while, that he had to slaughter, and there were some Kohanim standing by with vessels to catch the blood to pour it on the altar. It's not for our sensibilities. On the other hand, the question comes up, what was it supposed to do then? Because if it turns out that it no longer will do for us what it was to do for them then we are in trouble. Because that means that these issues that were supposed to take us to those places of transformation no longer work for us. And that would then be a very sad situation. So I want to begin with a prayer, the prayer that we say every day in studying Torah. You commanded us, you commanded us to exercise our awareness in your Torah. For this instruction we offer you our appreciation, Ya Ardel. We ask that we may find zest and delight in the words of your teaching. May we and our children and their children too become intimate with you. And with pure intent, immerse ourselves in the Torah. Baruch atah Yah, you mentor your people in Torah. Baruch atah Yah, I offer you my thanks, Cosmic Majesty, and worship you for selecting us from among all nations to reveal to us that Torah which is meant for us. Baruch atah Yah, you keep gifting us with your Torah. People often misunderstand when you say something about chosenness, about specialness. But in this blessing, I'm making it clear that there is some Torah that's chosen, that's given to us, because it fits our DNA, if you will, our spiritual DNA. And it's very clear that, for instance, people living elsewhere, in different situations, in a different way of feeling the earth, the demand of the earth under our feet, speak to us, that they would come with another form of religion. It wouldn't be the same. So while we are saying that this one is meant for us, we are not saying that it's better or worse. We are saying, well, how would I say, if a doctor would prescribe something for a cancer patient, and he would prescribe something for a heart patient, and then they would switch them around, and each one would get the other person's medicine. It would be very clear that this wouldn't work, right? So when it says in the Talmud that the Torah is meant to be for us the Sam HaChayim, the elixir of life, that medicine, Barata Yitzhara, Barata Lo Torah, Table Table. You created our inclination for evil, but you also gave us something, and tabling is a funny word. It means to marinate in, you know? In other words, the inclination that we have for selfishness and for evil is not so bad. It depends what is the marinated sin. Because if you don't have motivation, and if you don't feel that you want to do anything, if you don't feel that self, Alan Watts used to say, love means to be able to say to someone, I love you with the purest selfishness. So when the Torah says, "Ve'ahavta es Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavecha, b'chol nafshecha, b'chol nodecha," it means the same thing. We love Hashem with the purest selfishness. So I need to review with you some ideas, and I do hope I'm not going to flood you, and you'll see where I'm going, because it's going to be hard going, so I want us to follow. The halachic basis that we find today in our lives takes its underpinnings from the book of Deuteronomy. Now, let's get to the description. They used to ask in Cheder, Mi Amar El Mi, who said what to whom? And it says the last book of Moses, which is called Deuteronomy, which is in Hebrew called Mishneh Torah, and it really means a second time of giving the law. Deutero, second, nomos, the law, Deuteronomy. So he gives us the law again, and in which way does he give it to us? Like a person who says, you shmigegs, you backsliders, I've had sodas for so many years, schlepping you around. I'm telling you, don't you move to the right, don't move to the left. This has to be exactly as I tell you. Don't mess with it, okay? Then we come a little bit later to King Solomon. And there we're going to find a time for everything. A time to do, a time not to do, a time to do this, a time not to do that. You know, that things shift and change. No longer absolute, the thing has become dynamic. I think that's a very important point. Recently, after we had the trouble with our election, a man by the name of Lakoff came out with an important book. In it he claims that what more than any of the other propaganda and the money that was spent on the Bush side for winning the election, they had created a frame. And that frame was imposed on the mind of America. And because that frame was so strong that people couldn't even think outside of that frame,
And he describes that there is a frame that is made by an issue that is the strong father in charge. And so the great white father in Washington, is the guy who is like the Pope. He cannot make any mistake, When he speaks ex cathedra all over the states in order to get people to do what isn't good for them. There is a sense that the frame has been established, and under that frame, unless you change the frame, it's not going to help. Now let me ask the question, what kind of a frame are we dealing with in the book of Deuteronomy? So we hear, again, King Solomon saying in Proverbs, Shema b'ni musar avicha ve'al titosh Torah imecha. Listen, my son, to the reproof of the father, and do not put aside, forsake the Torah of your mother. So you get from this that the same Torah appears to some people as being Musar Avicha, and therefore it says you must always do like Deuteronomy, and sometimes it comes on like Torah Timecha. And what does it want us to do? It wants Derachea Darchei Noam, again from King Solomon. Her ways are ways of pleasantness. So many things have to do with Shalom Bayit, and as you were saying before, all the books in the Bible that speak about taking care of the poor, and the few passages that say the thing about gays and so on and so forth. So you get a very different attitude when you look at Musar Avicha than when you look at Torah Timecha, the mother teaching. And with the advent of feminism and its mind, there is a sense that if Jewish renewal is to do something in this coming time, it will have to go more along the road of Torah Timecha than going along the Musar Avicha. And so renewal is interested in changing the frame from the notion of Papa tells you got to do it, and that is heteronomy. That's to say heteronomos, the law is imposed by someone else. And we have the sense that we want to operate with autonomy. That's to say, we call the shots for ourselves. If we give full consent to something, if we take the initiative, it feels it's ours, we own it, we feel much stronger about it. So if there was a situation in the past when we lived in a ghetto, I'm jumping a little bit on the outline, but it fits in here right now. And those of you who have seen Shylock recently, the Merchant of Venice, they had a very beautiful piece at the beginning. They said, we want you to know what it was like to be a Jew in those years. You had to live in a very close quarter, that's the ghetto. You couldn't make a living from anything else but from usury. You couldn't own land, you couldn't do some of the crafts. The guilds were all locked up by other people. And so this was the situation in which we found ourselves. That meant also that the pressure from outside, as well as the pressure from inside, which was, if you live in the ghetto and everybody knows your business, there is no way in which you can do anything else than be a Jew. And if you didn't want to be a Jew, then you would have to make a radical shift, run to the church, get yourself baptized or something like that, because there was no other way out. You were in the shtetl, you belonged. So you were not a Jew by choice. And when you speak today of everyone, even born Jews, they would have to say we're Jews by choice. Which brings us back to the issue of autonomy. Everybody is in that same situation. Now, one of the things that has to do with how do we define what is halacha, what is the norm, that's much harder to speak about than it was before. Because as long as you have it mapped out in a book, and you can describe from the morning, as you open your eyes, you say Modeh Ani, until you say the last words of Hamapil, and then you mustn't talk until the morning again. Everything is laid down, everything is described. That's in the book. But all the time, it's not the book that defines it, because there is a social element that I call the consensus of the committed, the consensus of the pious. Okay? And that consensus shifts for each group, if you will, for each community. It is so interesting how even that consensus has become a lot freer than it used to be. What do I mean to say by that? I will be coming to one of the Orthodox minyanim here in town, and everybody is quite clear that I didn't walk from Lehigh. And still they will call me to the Torah and sometimes allow me to participate. Why is that? Because there wouldn't have been a minyan without me. And so then you have to go to the consensus of that minyan. Do you see what I'm getting at? And that is not explicit, it's implicate. And that's a very important distinction. Because while the book, the heteronymous teaching, can be explicit, that is very sort of, we are all complicit, in creating that implicit way that we call the consensus of the pious. So, if we want to be able to do something like Psycho-Halakhah, that is to say, to build from our situation of the past and say, how do we bring this into our time? We first have to do something that's called deconstruction. And that's a hard one, because the question is, if you were to speak to the people who are in the father Musar thing, they would say, you have no right to do that. Who are you to do that? If the father doesn't do it, you can't do it. See? On the other hand, if I want to take responsibility for my consciousness and my behavior and my covenant with God, then I have to say, not only do I have the right, it's a mitzvah. I must spend the time to ask myself, Ma Hashem Elokecha shoel imcha? What is it that God is asking from us today? And it's so interesting to hear that even evangelicals are beginning to think, what is God asking of us today? One of the men described in there had heard the thing about air pollution, and he was convinced by someone else to get himself a Prius. A Prius, a car that is a Prius. A Prius. All right. Why don't you say pious as a very pious Jew? so it's all right. I go with Prius. But you see that it got to action, to behavior, to say, I was convinced that to drive the other one is no longer eco-kosher. It's in their language now, but in our language it comes out that way. So, what right have we got to deconstruct? The answer is, we have been given so much insight and consciousness, much more than people had who were a lot more primitive in the way in which they thought about things before. And you can't, after Freud, go anymore without introspection and transpersonal psychology, and you have to start figuring out, why is it that we do things, and why was it done then, and what was it supposed to do? Anthropology has helped us also, so that I can now go back and ask, when a particular mitzvah was given then, Never mind the form that it took, the outer form, but the inner gestalt of how it created transformation in the person. That's what I want to know. So for instance, this week we begin to read in the Torah about Moses that built the tabernacle. Moses is outside of the tabernacle because the presence of God is so overwhelming he can't stand it. He goes outside and then God says, Moshe, come here. Vayikra el Moshe, he called to Moshe. And he said, come, let me now tell you what we got to do in that building that has now been set up and dedicated. And he said, Adam, Yakri Miken Korban Hashem. A human being, if he will offer of himself a sacrifice unto the Lord. That's the introduction. Okay. Then it says, but I'll do you a favor, I'll take a sheep instead. Okay. Do you see what's happening? It tells us that what we have to give is of our being, of our substance. But if you're a shepherd culture, then your substance is sheep. You know? What happens if you are today in our situation? So in this way, money has become a very important element, except as Jesus pointed out, Jesus, that the widow's mite may be more important even to God than the treasure of a rich person. So you cannot measure it in the same way. Last Shabbos, we read a book, the section is called Shkalim, and everybody, rich and poor, had to give a half a shekel. And that's so amazing a teaching because it says that money, the transfer of money, has to go between the one who has and the one who needs. You know? Story. It's before Pesach. Reb Naftali Ropshitzer comes home after he's given the droshe. Because on Shabbos HaGadol, the Shabbos before Pesach, you give the long droshe. It was very important. Most of the time, rabbis prepared some very fancy pilpul and so on and so forth. He comes home and she says to him, "Nu, how did the droshe go?" He says, "Half of it I achieved." What did you preach about? That the rich should help the poor make Pesach, and the poor are willing. I convinced the poor. Okay? So you get the sense of machzis shekel, that if they are willing to take, that's only half of it. Right. The others are willing to give, and that's the other half of it. So that's necessary. So I go and ask in each situation, in the deconstruction, what was it that was supposed to happen at that time? On the way here, Reb Michael, with whom I had these wonderful conversations, raised the issue of how do we deal with guilt today that we no longer have sacrifice, because, you know, all the easy things that we are doing, but does it go deep enough? Does it really change? And it's a good question. So it turns out that if I ask myself, how did a thing begin? It begins with somebody having an insight. Example, Jacob sleeps that night in that place and has this amazing dream of the ladder going up. And what does he say? This must be God's house. I'll have to do something about that. I'll build God's house here. Good. Then, that stone must be marked in a special way. If he would pour water over it, it would dry up right away. But oil is a different story. Okay, so he puts oil on. Let me go still deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and more ancient, and I come back to the same thing about the lingam in Hinduism, a stone over which milk or oil is poured. And it speaks about fertility and the relationship with God. It's a very powerful element. So this was an insight that he had. And this insight was strong. And then later on, other people followed it. It's a good insight, it's a good thing to do. And they created what you call minhag. Minhag is the way in which we conduct ourselves. And after a while, what happens is that the minhag becomes a law. It's the way in which society creates a way for traffic control
And it says the best way not to bump into each other is that we should all zig together and zag together, that we should have a rule about that. So you notice that from the soft inside, it becomes a little bit more solid as a custom, you get to a very strong, solid law. Now, some of the people who have given us deep interpretations come up with the following. They said that one of the things that happened at Sinai when God and Moses were dealing with how the Torah comes down was that Moses said to God, Maseh avot siman levanim. What our ancestors have done, that's a good sign for the children. Would it be okay if we did the same, and would you therefore make sure that when we do that, that the divine flow would come down just the same way as when they did it at first, and it was powerful and transformative. Now that we have to set it up as a routine, dear God, would you agree that this should be so? In Latin, they call such a thing ex opere operatum. While you're doing it, the fact that you're doing it creates the situation, even if it is done in a physical way. So what the fathers did is assigned to the children. Now what about the time when the fathers did it? So we have a word in Ezekiel's prophecy. Ezekiel saw the wheel way in the middle of the air, and what was that? They described it as a Merkava. Merkava would be a vehicle. But to us, when we hear about the vehicle, it doesn't necessarily mean with four wheels on top. It means the instrumentality. And the best way in which I could say a ventriloquist has a dummy, So keeps talking, So what happens is the dummy has become, for the ventriloquist, the vehicle. Now that is when the dummy can't help himself. But what happens when I have the freedom of choice about it? And I feel that there is a mandate that comes from the living God, and I say, dear God, I'm willing that you deploy me any way you want. I'm offering myself to be a vehicle for your will. Get that sense? Now, if Abraham did it, and then we go and check out what did he do, he invited guests, he had hospitality, he circumcised himself. You go all the things that Abraham did, and you say, now that's the way in which one can become a vehicle to God. So I'm going into the issue of the deconstruction still, right? They were a vehicle, and that tells us that we too could be vehicles, and this is what our covenant is about. Now, then comes the question, what's the form of so many of the mitzvahs that we have? And we find that we have a lot of instinctual things that we would like to do. Let me begin with eating. I want to eat. Wait a minute, make a bracha. Become conscious that in everything that we have that is instinctual behavior, we get a stop exercise that says, become conscious of what you're doing. Make a bracha. Socialize your thing. For instance, you harvest a field, leave some for the poor. You get the idea? Every mitzvah has some of that element of saying, you can't do it. Mitzvot tzrichot kavanah. Mitzvahs need that you should come to awareness, that you should wake up. And when that happens, then the mitzvah is full, then it's right. So we have blessings before we eat. One, it says,
kala belo bracha asura alav kenida. A bride, if you haven't said the brachas, is forbidden to the bridegroom. It's something not kosher. So you get the idea here in the same way that there's a stop exercise that says before you go instinctual, think about it, socialize. In kashrut it's the same thing. At one point you bake challah. It is so wonderful. We don't have it in the same means that we had it before. But you have to take one little piece of dough and make a bracha and separate it out. And that little piece of dough is to be given to the kohen. So in our house we don't burn it. I get to eat it. Okay. But let me tell you something, I also eat it with a certain kind of consciousness, because it was done in such a way that the kohen has to be like an altar. So when I eat this, I want to say, this is a holy act that I'm doing, just like when in the past, Kohanim used to eat certain portions of the sacrifice. Some of it would go on the altar, but some of it had to be eaten by them. And tzedakah, of course, is that element that's really important here. In the middle of prayer, before you begin to pray, first, Yaif tzedakah le'ani v'hoda matzliv. Let him first give tzedakah to someone poor, and then daven. That element of sharing one's wealth in this way, tzedakah, is a basic thing that goes into what makes halacha for us. So let's review. We begin with a model that has come down to us from the past, and it has organic connection to the past. So if someone were to build and create a situation and say, I have a new custom that I'd like to bring into the situation that doesn't have any roots in the past, it wouldn't feel Jewish. For instance, putting on a seatbelt was just a secular thing until one day, as I'm reading in the Chumash, that if you build a house and it has a flat roof, you have to have a fence around it so nobody should fall down. It's a safety mechanism. So I'm getting under the car and putting on the seatbelt, okay? I'm following the same mitzvah. The mitzvah is no longer, it's not my issue on the roof, but it says in the Torah, Pen yipol hanofel, lest the person will fall, lest the person will be injured. And you get to see that we want to be able to plant whatever new thing that we're doing, that it should have a connection. That's so important. Now, do you have a right to do such a thing? Well, let me go a little bit and undermine the Papa frame here, okay? The Torah says very clearly, don't burn any fires in all your dwelling on the Sabbath day. On that basis, one would have to go around before Shabbos and quench every fire that's around. No. I tell you, if you live in an agricultural situation and you live in a long country and all that kind of stuff, not so bad. But what happens is, after a while, people are getting used to doing some things at night with artificial light. The sun isn't there anymore. And during the week, a poor household, when you need the oil for food, you would barely have one oil lamp, so you can find your way around in the dark. So the Chachamim said that during the week you have one light, on Shabbos you have to have two. And then they did a wonderful thing. They said, since the Shabbos commandment is given in two places in the Torah, it's been given as Shamor and Zachor, so one light is for Shamor, one light is for Zachor. And I like that. It's like Mama would say, eat a spoon for the bubby, So one candle for Shamor, one for Zachor, and so on. And then the rabbis have said the reason why we want that to be is that there should be shalom bayis. There should be peace, harmony in the family. Now, but it says in the Torah you shouldn't have any fire burning. So the Chachamim said, yeah, so you light it before. And what before was no fire, we now make into a mitzvah, yes, fire, if you light it before. So therefore you have to be very careful. Bameh madlikin and bameh ein madlikin. What oils may you use, what oils can you not use, what kind of wicks do you use, what kind of wicks you don't use. And the prescription comes just to make sure that on Shabbos you shouldn't have to mess with the wick and the oil, shema yate, so you get the right setting set up. And that's how the Chachamim set it up. Okay. Now, on the one hand, if you were a fundamentalist, you would say, what kind of a newfangled thing have you come up with candle lighting? It says very clear in the Torah and so on and so forth. So the Chachamim came up with a very beautiful understanding. They said, there's a sentence in the Torah that says, Eit la'asod la'Hashem, heperu toratecha. There's a time that we have to do something for God. Sometimes you have to turn the Torah a little bit. Okay? So that's the way they came. And so, but it doesn't say in the Torah we should light candles. And yet we say, blessed are you who have commanded us to light the candle. Heikan tzivanu, the rabbi said, where is it written that we have to light candles? Then they say, it is written when you won't know what the law is and you'll go up to Jerusalem, there'll be priests and there'll be judges at that time. Ve'asita kechol asher yiruchu, you better do what they tell you then. Okay? And why is that? Because as Moshe Rabbeinu said to Pharaoh, Ki lo neda ma na'avod la'Hashem Elokeinu ad bo'inu shama. We don't know how to serve God until we get there. And now we have gotten to another place and this is how it has to be. I'll come back to that notion about Shabbos a little bit later. A law. 6 years you are running the planting in the field, the 7th year you are to let it lie fallow. You cannot allow any debt to go longer than 7 years. When the 7th year comes, the debts are cancelled. That was wonderful at a time when we were in agriculture, because at that time it was preventing us from feudalism. Because as we have seen, even with Joseph and the people in Egypt, that at the time, for seed money, for the seed, for the field, they had to sell themselves as slaves even. And you go to medieval Europe and you found the same kind of a situation until in the end the people who owned the land became sharecroppers and had to deliver, and sometimes even slaves, and had to deliver for the food that they had eaten. So what did Hillel do? He said, and here is the wonderful way in which you weave within the law, and that is what some people don't want to deal with. They say, you're going to change it and throw the old one away. And no, it doesn't work, because if you do that, once you create a scofflaw situation, the whole foundation falls down. So what you really want to do is make sure it is usable. How do you do that? So Hillel says like this, I can imagine him pulling his beard. He said, what kind of debts are cancelled? Private debts, that's what the Torah says. But a public debt isn't cancelled. So therefore, if you go to court and you make from your private debt a public debt, and you get a paper that says this has become a public debt, the debt isn't cancelled, and now in the 6th year I can lend you money because you're not anymore a farmer, you're a merchant, and how are you going to do your business if you can't get credit at that point? So it creates a situation that makes it livable. It uses the law to be able to find where the law gives the possibility. So we have two situations where we went from the stricter to the easier. Now I'll show you another one. In the beginning it was, Hakol shochtin u'shchitatan kshera. Everybody can be a shochet. Well, you're a farmer. You are not going to go and send for someone to come from Williamsburg to be a shochet for you. So you're going to dispatch your animal yourself. And you were told how you might do it, Be careful about it, but you could do it. There was a man in town, Oregon, the name I can't remember at this point, it doesn't come right, in Deadwood, Oregon, who had become a Jew. He embraced Judaism. He was married to a Jewish woman. We converted him. He also is into Native American stuff, and he is the one who stopped the spraying there for his trees and so on and so forth, and he's a very good guy. So he was telling me about how from time to time he has to dispatch an animal, and he wants to know how to do it. I had in my possession 2 steer halofim, those special knives that the shochet uses, and the stones with which to hone them. And I taught him how, and he has been the one who slaughtered for the people in his neighborhood. And they come to him, and he is doing this with compassion. So, there was a point that if you were to say to someone from Brooklyn, would you eat from his shechita? And they say, oh, it's nicht glatt, it's not this, not that, I have to check the challah, I have to do this, I have to do that. So when Johnny met me last time was in Ashland, he brought me a piece of meat that he had himself slaughtered, and he had soaked and salted. He did everything the way it should be, and he wanted me to eat it. No, I ate it. But if you see how the law has shifted now, that you cannot use just any knife, as they had said before. They said bakol shochtin, you could use anything, afilu kumi cholkane, that you could even use a piece of bamboo that sharpened the silicone part of it. And now they've gone, not everybody can be a shochet, and very special, and the special equipment, the special knife, and the special preparation, and so on and so forth. I'm glad that this has happened, because it had kept pace with our technology. So when Reb Shneir Zalman at one point had introduced Swedish hollow ground blades, because beforehand the rule was that if you wanted to be a shochet, you had to smithy your own knife even. Now you can imagine that the edge was pretty thick at the end, you know. So when all of a sudden these blades came from Sweden, and hollow ground and so on and so forth, and they were called sakinim melutashim, so he instituted that they should use these. Well, the people in Vilna were against it. Newfangled stuff. It isn't kosher. The funny thing is, it was more kosher than before, but they didn't want to buy it because it didn't get created on their turf, if you will, you know. So you see that in some ways we are willing to go and make things more stringent, because in order to keep up with the technology, we need to do that. We now know more precisely what we are dealing with. Shabbos. The Torah says that you must not do any melacha, delegatable work that you're not doing because you want to do it yourself, but it's work that needs to be done because you need the product. Got that? The issue of delegating. I don't care who's going to do it. It has to get done, and I'll pay someone to do it. So we have that. That mustn't be done on Shabbos. But this is in a money economy. What would be if you don't have a money economy? Then you would have to define which kinds of work go. So they talk about agricultural things, you know, making a furrow, even to the point of writing 2 letters on Shabbos. All these things, who wrote at one point? You went to a notary public. That's what it was. The notary public was the one who noted down for you what you said, because many people couldn't write. So it was very much, again, the same kind of a thing of a product. So now you say, you see how the laws of Shabbos have proliferated as we're going to the point that the question is, can you open a refrigerator if the light would go on? Or if that would turn on the rheostat so that it would start cooling again, you know? So now that they have made Shabbos clocks for these things, and some people have unscrewed before Shabbos, unscrewed the light, and so on and so forth. What you see here is a way in which people have refined and refined and refined to the point that sometimes the thing has become too complex, too burdensome. Okay. Now, when we get into Reconstruction, we need to not only do social reconstruction and historic reconstruction. Remember, we have deconstructed something. We asked the question, what was its purpose at the beginning? We want to create the same kind of a situation for us that would fit our technology, our mind space, what we need to do in order to do it right. Now, Professor Mordechai Kaplan, the founder of Reconstructionism, lived in the 30s. And I'm saying lived in the 30s. That's important because even in the 60s he lived in the 30s. I still live in the 70s sometimes, you know. You know what I'm getting at? The basic notion was that in his day, pragmatism was the way in which he talked about these things. And he was saying, we don't need a shul anymore or only for prayer. We need a shul for the community. It's a Beit HaKnesset, it's a gathering place. So he said, instead of building synagogues, build Jewish centers. They should also have a place where liturgy can be celebrated. But don't only use it for liturgy, use it for other things too, if you need to have an assembly and so on and so forth. That was his way of dealing with it. That was good. Something was missing. What was missing is that thing that happens to us when we walk into a church, some churches, and we get a sense of the incense there, and it is sort of dark, and there's a sanctuary light up there, and somehow you decide you walk on tiptoe and you will not talk loud. Do you see what I'm saying? That attitude of I'm coming into a sanctuary was no longer there. Why? Because Reconstructionism had a very low ceiling. It didn't deal with higher and spiritual things. When you talk to Professor Kaplan, what does God mean to you? He would say, God is the guarantor of values. A good thing, you know, but notice how social it is, right? It doesn't talk about spirituality. God is the power that makes for salvation. It was the highest level that he could go. But what does salvation mean? You know, it just meant to live a good life here on earth, because he wasn't into the afterlife at all. No. We need to transcend the merely social and historic in our designing of the halacha, the Psycho-Halakhah for our time. We have to bring in the transpersonal, and we have to be aware of the paradigm shift. And I have a feeling sometimes that when people come to Jewish renewal services, and they enjoy the Freilich, you know, it's more exciting. You sing, you dance, you hug each other, you know, all these wonderful things are there. And they feel that this is the way it always has been. Yeah. Because they haven't come into a situation and known the birth pangs of Jewish renewal, what we had to go through until we got to the place where we are now. And so, you have to understand what the paradigm shift is about. A different way of thinking, a different way of seeing ourselves in the world, and that means post-triumphalist. It means that not we are on top and the goyim are below. It doesn't mean that goyim are there just to be Shabbos goyim, as it were, and in our service. It meant a whole bunch of things that shifted in our awareness, in our mind. So, if that's the situation where we are in, and we are also asking, if you live only by the shopping mall mentality, you'll never get to transformation. And all of us, if we have worked a little bit on our own inner life, feel that we need to transform. We feel that there is an inertia that wants to keep us down, that wants to keep us in a trance, that wants to keep us asleep, that wants to keep us make the same mistake over and over again, and we get so pissed at ourselves each time when it happens, and we know it just mustn't go on like this. So what do we have to do? We have to transform. And then comes the question, so good, I'll transform. How do I transform? Because give me a lever and I can lift the whole world out of the place. But what's the lever for transformation? In other words, to transform oneself is like I like to say, from Susan Sachs, who pointed it out to me, is like changing the tires in the car while you're driving. You see the difficulty that we have. It is something that has to happen, go so deep and transformative, and at the same time, we have to steer it. Nobody's going to do the transforming for me. I have to work on the transforming myself. If I don't practice, if I don't do it, it's not going to happen. So if I have to do it myself, and I'm the one who has to change me, you see what I'm saying? That's very much like, so how do we do that? So that also means that somehow I have to reach out to forces and to powers that are greater than I. That if anybody thinks they can do self-transformation by themselves alone, forget it. You need what we call siyata dishmaya, the help of heaven for that. So, there are some social changes that have happened as a result of the paradigm shift. Example. One of the reasons why they would say you don't call women to the Torah is because kevod hatzibur. It is not fitting for the congregation that a woman should have an aliyah. Okay? Now, you want to know where this is true? In societies that are homosocial. To this day, you can see in Saudi Arabia, women will not drive. You know, there's purda, separation. It is very, very clear that in that setting you can't do anything else. Because there are homosocial. That's to say, even with men, you may have seen pictures of men walking in the Middle East, holding each other, you know, and so on and so forth. And it is not a homosexual situation. It's dafke that, you know, you see the leaders, the Arab leaders kissing each other, you know, the whole geschäft. That's the way in which things are, that's how you, if you will, grease the social wheels there. But for us, when the question came up, should we call women to the Torah? Is it kavod hatzibur for a woman to come up or not? Because the whole reason that's being given is kavod hatzibur. And since we are no longer a homosocial society, but a heterosocial society, we work together with women, we do things together with women. So to daven together with women, to call women to the Torah, no longer is the meaning of the honor of the congregation. Okay? So I said this before, that all of us are Jews by choice, and now I want to talk a little bit about halacha in the red and American kosher. some time ago, there was a symposium done by Commentary magazine, and I responded to the symposium the following way. They're talking about what do you think about halacha and kashrus, because that's a question always come up. So I said, imagine this man goes to a restaurant and the waitress says, we have a special on pork chops today. And he says, no, I don't eat of unclean animals. I would like to have beef instead. So she says, yes, we have, you can have a steak. Would you like to have a pat of butter on top? Oh, no, he said, I don't mix meat and milk. Okay. Notice how this person has made choices that are not in the black. Do you know what I'm saying? It's not like saying he's gone to a kosher restaurant, ordered a kosher meal. Right. He's going to a non-kosher restaurant, but the choices he is making on the way are already choices that take into consideration halakha. Finally she said, oh, I forgot to tell you, we also have trout today. Oh, he says, that's wonderful. I'd like to have the trout instead. Okay? The man made all kinds of choices, but he still is eating it on plates that, get the idea what I'm saying?
Right.
So, it's not that he is an unhalachic person,
Right.
but he is, as far as Orthodox people will be concerned, halacha in the red, not in the black, okay? He still has a deficit, if you will, to that level, but he is in the game.
Right.
He's paying attention and he's thinking about that. Now, the same way, I think, when I talked to Larry Kushner one day, he is the one who coined American kosher. And so I asked him, what do you mean? He says, when you go and you have fish and you check whether the soup is a vegetarian soup or it has a meat stock inside, and you decide you don't want the meat stock soup, you'll want a vegetarian one. So you have made these and that has created a level in which there's a consensus, if you will, of the committed in our circle that they will eat this kind of kosher. Okay? So he calls it American kosher. Now, I've talked about the transpersonal element, and I hope you have sitzfleisch today. Because we're only on the first page. Okay. All right. There are 4 levels to the brain. And if you understand transpersonal, you'll realize that a lot of halacha has been directed to what people would call behaviorism. There was one man in Jerusalem, a great teacher. His name was Professor Leibowitz, and he was saying that it has nothing to do with God. Halacha is you just keep the rules, never mind all that other stuff. Now, I don't blame him because, if you go and see, because most people don't understand transpersonal. They think that transpersonal psychology doesn't take care of behaviorism. There are some situations where I want to break a habit, if you will. I want to break an addiction. I have to begin with cold turkey. That's behaviorism. So that's the ground, that's for the world of Asiya. But then you have to get to other places that you say, but what did that serve at one point, that addiction? What did it serve at that point? And you go into feeling states. And then you go, how did you perceive reality? And beyond that, so you look at the feeling states as psychoanalysis. How do you perceive reality is rational psychology, or if you will, humanistic psychology. And then you go to transpersonal. And transpersonal has to do with things having to do with soul, not only with the personal subconscious, but a wholly unconscious that has archetypes inside, that has God reaching into us, and so on and so forth. And these are very important parts. Now, when you understand how to make a new custom, if you will, a new practice, the practice has to reflect what happens on a higher level as well as what happens on a lower level. Let me spell this one out. I mentioned before that some things come from earth. These are the chthonic mitzvahs. Chthonic, earth arising mitzvahs. I'm sure that someone who learned how to use compost didn't get that mitzvah from heaven, but got that mitzvah from earth. Do you know what I'm saying? So there are a whole bunch of earthy things. And so what is the mitzvah that gets designed has to have an earth quality to it. But it also has to have a heaven quality to it. So there are fractals, if you can imagine, there are gestalts. This is the earth gestalt, and it has a reason gestalt, and it also has a feeling gestalt, and it has a spiritual and moral gestalt. And all these have to sort of be like holons, one on top of the other. They're like boxed into each other. And so a good mitzvah has the organicity of all the forms in it, that it will have earth stuff, it will have heaven stuff, it will have feeling stuff, it will have mind stuff, and the right kavanah. That is the vertical dimension where we deal with God. There is another vertical dimension. It has to be connected with all of Israel. That's to say, we have to be able to say that our ancestors, V'hi she'amta la'avoteinu v'lanu, the matzah zu she'anu ochlim, because our parents ate matzah. You get the idea that we have this level of historic growth. But we also have to deal with a horizontal thing. The strange thing is that a Jew cannot say what I'm doing is Jewish if other Jews don't agree that this is Jewish. You know what I'm saying? It's like the mother who said to her son who came, he bought himself a boat with an outboard motor, and comes with a captain's cap, and says, "Mommy, I'm a captain." And she said, "But me, you're always a captain, but the captains are your captain." Okay? So in the way in which to say, do other Jews recognize that this is a way to Jew, to be a Jew? Now that's an important part, but then it depends which. And so you have to remember that most of the people want to cut off others from their continuum. They would want to say only the people within this narrow range I recognize as being good Jews and all the others don't fit. But if I'm going to the organismic understanding of what Klal Yisrael is, then I have to go from the humanistic secular people to Neturei Karta, where it's all of us, one people. And all of us are organically connected. So the specifics then become eco-kosher. On Shabbos we have to understand that what is not delegatable, and I mentioned that at other times, that for instance if someone who doesn't have time, I don't want to hire a gardener. I want to do it myself. Just, nobody would think, for instance, let me hire someone to make love to my wife. What a stupid attitude that is. Yeah? So if I want to go and don't make pots in order to sell them, I'm not interested in the product. But what happens to me when I'm doing the centering around the wheel and I'm shaping the clay, and that's my Shabbos. It's going to be very hard to say, because you see, we don't do pottery from clay for products anymore. So it is with every art. When Rembrandt got the commission, he made a living from that. But the person who says, a whole week I haven't got time, but I so love to watercolor, what should I say about them? Should they do it on Shabbos? Should they not do it on Shabbos? Do you see what I'm saying? So I'm going into the depth of the thing and I'm raising this question. It's not delegatable then. Timing. You know, I would like to see us light the candles before Shabbos. I think it's really important to make that sense when dusk comes and the candles are lit and you worked up until that time in a frenzy to get Shabbos in, and you've charged the flywheel, you know, and all of a sudden you stop, but the flywheel is still running. And what do you do with the energy of the flywheel? Lechu meranen al Adonai. Do you see what I'm saying? It still has the energy of the weekday running, but you use it at this point to lift up with that. So I'd like it to be that people will light candles at the right time. But what happens when you don't? It's winter, you're coming home, you couldn't get home any sooner than you did get home. Now, according to Halakhah as a past paradigm, you say, forget it, it's too late. Now, I don't need candlelight to be utilitarian today. It's the last sacrifice that I have with fire. An incense stick and a candle. So when people come and decide to light candles, when they can light candles, and they don't drive each other crazy because of the clock, that's also to be considered. Remember, the reason for lighting candles was shalom bayis. And you can imagine what you can get into a frenzy when people are saying, once again, you did this extra errand, you shouldn't have done this before Shabbos, you know. And they get angry at each other. What's the point? That wasn't the point. Okay. Next, prayer. We were so clear at one time that we wanted to have our prayer to be in Hebrew. And that was very clear, because they said, the angels who have to take our prayer to God will garble it. And it's so funny, it's almost like saying, there's certain files you can't send with AOL. Right. It'll come out garbage at the end, you know. So you have to have, you have to say it in Hebrew because they can handle that kind of procedure. But if you say it in any other language, the Malochim verstehen nicht kein Targum loschen, was the word. They don't understand Aramaic, okay? Today I feel the thing is the opposite around. I come to shul, I want to daven as much as I can in Hebrew, because that is what Zalman Schachter, who was the founder of conservative Judaism, used to call Catholic Judaism. By that he meant universal. A Yemenite Jew would come in, or a Moroccan Jew would come in, and you daven in Hebrew, he knows where you are, even if he doesn't understand your language. So that's an important element to keep. But when you're davening on your own at home, and you're just to try to get done with it fast, and you don't know what you're saying, that doesn't make sense. So there's a switch again, you see. Before the switch was, in private you do in Hebrew, but in public you may do in English, because then the Shekhinah is there, you don't need the angels to translate it. Okay, that was the old understanding. The new understanding is psychologically, for you when you're alone, the vernacular is a better way of davening. And I want to say that the simple Jew in America today needs the vernacular very badly, and it's helpful. Then there is a thing that was called the teachings of the hour and the needs of the hour. Even in the old days, when it was forbidden to bring sacrifices at any other place but Jerusalem, only there Shama Taviyu et Korbanchem. So at this point, something else was happening. Prophet Elijah had a run-in with the prophets of the Baal, and that was near Mount Carmel. And he had asked them to offer up a sacrifice to Baal, but not to light any fire. And he said, I'll do a sacrifice, you do a sacrifice. And we'll see which God will send down the fire for the sacrifice. It's an amazing story. It's very exciting. They set up their sacrifice, he sets up his sacrifice, and he has them dig around the altar like a moat and fill it with water and pour over the wood and over the sacrifice more water to drench the whole business. They start to pray and they gash their bodies and they're bleeding, they're crying, Baal, answer us. And Elijah said, maybe he's asleep. Louder, he taunts them there. Maybe he doesn't want to interrupt what he's doing with his consort, And so the whole morning has gone by and nothing is happening. And then he prays to God and fire comes down and eats up the sacrifice and the altar and the water and the whole business. Now, what was he doing at that time? You could say, if you would have been from the Torah County, you would have said, Matunish, a sacrifice has to be offered in Jerusalem. But it was a necessary thing at that hour. And that's called Hora'at Sha'ah, the teaching of the hour. Do you get the idea? The question is, are we not today to listen to the teaching of the hour? And when I speak of Eko Kashrut, that is definitely teaching of the hour. Okay? When we talk about recognizing women into a minyan, into the davening, that's part of the teaching of the hour. These are the hours, what these hours have brought to us. So how do we build that? First of all, the eco-kashrut, the Psycho-Halakhah has to be dealing with the Gaian concerns. And they are very, very clear, even as you see, the evangelicals are getting it already, okay? There are also ecumenical concerns that has to do with how do we deal with people of other religions. I think I may have told you once I was trying to get a job in Israel to be working for the Misrat Hadatot, for the religious ministry. And what did I want to do? I wanted to be liaison to the other communities, to bring a basket of special things to the archimandrite of the Greek Orthodox Church, and to have a good schmooze with him about his thing and let him feel that he's a mensch. This is not quite what has happened in Israel in relation to you see what I'm saying? We have ecumenical concerns. How do we deal with people who belong to other things, and we don't want to be either insulting and we also don't want to appropriate from them? Both of these are important. There's Tsar Balechayim. The suffering of animals is very important. Some stuff has come out about the slaughterhouse in Iowa that is very upsetting. It's supposed to be one of the best as far as glad kosher is concerned. And at the same time, animals aren't treated the right way. And so there's this woman who is an autistic woman in Fort Collins who has come up with a particular way of holding the animals and so on and so forth, so that they should not be freaked out and that they would be able to expire in a way that holds them rather than shackling them and pulling them up on their hind leg on chains, So what I'm saying is that I would like to see that a kashrut certificate should also say, just the way in which they're saying that this is under this hashgacha, it should also say, and Sar Balachayim has been observed, just to say the same way as in the movies now, the Hora'at Sha'ah has been that you show no animal was hurt in this process of community. I had a meeting with the board of the day school here, and they're doing remarkable work. And Soshi, who has now become the principal there, is a wonderful lady. And they're beginning to pay attention to the faith needs of the community, not only of the children, but also of the parents, because without bringing the parents somehow into the situation, it's going to create friction, and they won't understand what the kids are into. So social fibers are short, and we have to create better support fields, and the question of any psycho-halachic thing is, does this make for community support, or does it spoil that? One of the things the rabbis have said, Lo nitna ha-Torah ela letzarif bahen et havliot. The Torah was given to connect people to each other. It has another meaning also, letzarif, to put them through the crucible, to refine them. So both of these things are necessary. The transformational thing has to be to reach higher ethical and faith levels. And I can't go into great detail right now, but Lawrence Kohlberg is the one who spoke about moral development and how one goes from one level of moral development to another. And he had a student by the name of Fowler who was talking about faith development. And there was Carol Gilligan, who was also dealing with the same issue, and said, notice again, Kohlberg was right, but he also missed the women's growth of moral ethical development. Furthermore, a mitzvah has to have something that spiritual direction will bring to it. Take a look how we have said, why do we eat matzah? We were slaves, don't treat other people, remember you were slaves in Egypt. You get the idea? This is the bread of affliction. Each mitzvah has to have a component that somehow brings out for us a meaning. The lulav and the esrog, tells us this wonderful thing that there are some people who are full of mitzvahs and full of Torah. And that's the esrog, has a good smell and a good taste. Okay? Torah is the taste and mitzvah is the smell. Okay? Then there's the hadassim. Some people are good with mitzvahs. They don't stand out so much. They smell good, but they don't have a taste. Then there is the lulav. He's standing up there, very tall. He has a taste because he is from the date palm. And so he stands for the taste, and also the great learned person, outstanding person, learned. And then there's the arova, the poor willow, neither taste nor smell, nevertheless belongs to the four that you hold together. So you see that each time we had a way of reading in or reading out from meaning. That was a very important part. So, in this way, if a mitzvah reduces our resistance to God, it's a good mitzvah. If a mitzvah creates more resistance to God, it's not a good mitzvah. Can't even... well, let me give you an example. Purim is coming. My father, Olav HaSholem, on Purim there's a rule that you go, Kol HaPoshet Yad Notnim Lo. You stick out a hand, you're asking for a handout, you have to be given. Ein Botkin LeMezonot, you don't ask questions, you have to give. So it happened that in Europe there was a custom that people who didn't need it tzedakah themselves would be the ones who would go around and collect tzedakah for other people. And when my father went around collecting for tzedakah on Purim, people knew Shlomo, he most probably is collecting for a good cause. And like Maimonides says, you shouldn't know the giver and you shouldn't know the taker. The best tzedakah is done anonymously. People gave liberally. He comes around to this person who sees him coming and turns quickly to the east and starts davening Shemona Esrei. My dad sidles up to him and says, "V'anshei Sdom ra'im v'chata'im la'Hashem me'od." The people of Sodom, wicked and sinful are they, but they made themselves very holy to God. He was giving this guy the dig. I'll come around when you're finished with the Shemona Esrei. I'm not going to let you out from giving you get the idea?
Right.
sometimes people use the mitzvahs as a pretext for being present, for offering themselves to God. And that is what we have to watch out for, yeah? To reduce the resistance to God. What does God need from us? Now that's a whole other thing that you didn't get in, I want to say it clear, Reform didn't have a sense that God needs anything from us, because they were very much with Hermann Cohen, and Hermann Cohen was with Kant, and Kant was with all the philosophers, and they were saying at that time that God is impossible. That's to say, God doesn't need anything. God is perfect, omni, doesn't need anything from us. When Heschel comes around and says, God searched for man, that the whole point of creation and of the anthropic principle and of making the world, what does God want from us, There is something that God wants from us. And you cannot create a Judaism, a Halakhah, without taking that into consideration. Now what does God want from us? First of all, to create a God feel in the world. A God feel in the world. Whatever is happening now through the people who are going into the religious right, into fundamentalism and the stuff in Islam and so on and so forth, they're trying to make up, not in a skillful way, for the lack of the God feel that's happened in the world. And if you aren't sure about it, then watch TV for a while, and you see the absence, unless you get a channel where somebody is preaching at you. The sense to be able to see more of that this isn't our world, that this belongs to God, and that we have to serve in a different way, that isn't shown. So that needs to be brought into how we build the Psycho-Halakhah. Another thing has to be that sense of holiness. When I mentioned to you before that walking into tiptoe to a church, I like it that we love each other. I like it that we talk to each other. But you know what? I also like it very much that Reb Tirza sits with people a half hour in silence, sit, and people walk in. If they walk in on tiptoe and in silence. That's to say, I am recognizing that I'm not walking into my turf, I'm walking into a God place. Bevet Elohim nehalech beragesh. In the house of God we walk on tiptoe, would be your way of saying, okay? Now, the next part is to recognize that we want the Shekhinah to dwell with us, the divine presence. And so, here again, it's so wonderful. When I was a little kid, when my Papa would put on the talis and wrap it around himself like you do it at the beginning, over the head, I would like to creep under the talis and be with Papa. Right. Get the idea? It was a sense I wanted to be tachat kanfei hashchina. I want to really feel I'm under in the presence of the divine presence. And that sense of the feminine, of the mother, Torah Timecha, has to be there. Next, dveikut and nearer my God to be. Do I feel after I've done a mitzvah that it was closer to God or not? Okay, it's a criterion that we need to have. So, becoming a Merkava today, I talked about the deployment before. Then comes an interesting thing. There is a rule that certain laws are discussed in the Talmud, and there they say, we can't live up to this law yet. For instance, there's Hillel and Shammai, and we say we go with Hillel, but when Mashiach will come, we'll be able to go with Shammai. Shammai has a stricter view of things, we'll go with Shammai, okay? What this is really trying to say, that most of the mitzvahs that we do in our place and that we have done up to now are somehow a compromise between what God wants and what we can afford to do. But if we want to change the texture of life on the planet, we need to begin to work already with Messianic halacha. Get the idea? That's where Waskow was so right when he takes the word Hilchata leMashiach, saying this is the law that's going to be when Mashiach will come. He says, no, read it, Hilchata leMashiach toward Mashiach. This is a law that will bring us closer to Mashiach. In other words, instead of waiting for Mashiach, how would you behave if Mashiach had come? And look, even the fundamentalists are saying, what would Jesus do? Like this man said, what kind of a car would Jesus drive? Right? So, I want to just go, and we're going to come in closer landing. I cannot define this forever. At best, I can give some guidelines to it. And when people say, how come that other people in renewal aren't doing it like you are? My answer is that we are Klal Yisrael, we are an organism. Why is it that the heart is doing different than the liver? You know? We all have to do what is our part. So it is not a definition that used to be before, that the Shulchan Aruch says, and that meant Rabbi Yosef Karo laid it down, or Maimonides laid it down, that's everybody has to go by that, or the Chofetz Chaim, when he did the Mishnah Berurah, laid it down, everybody has to go by it. But on the other hand, we say, Puk Hazimai Amadabar, go out and see what the people are actually doing, like I was saying with this business of American kosher. What is the consensus of the pious today? Now, I would want to say it's really important, and that's why I like to say the word committed consensus of the pious, because if it is an upward striving commitment, consensus, that's to say it works for transformation, then we can count it. But if it says, leave me alone, you know, I have fulfilled my obligation, I've extricated myself from the grasp of my duty. You know, I've done the least amount and I'm finished with it. Well, that cannot shape what the Psycho-Halachic thing is going to do, because it doesn't do the psyche. It does only some of the halacha. It wants to be done with it, right? So I want to say, we are not talking about user-friendly cutting corners. We're not talking about Judaism light. And the process of creating the right psycho-halachic structure will take time. It'll take more of the consensus of the pious. It'll take more of the input of women. And we'll make mistakes. Bucky Fuller pointed this out and was so wonderful. He says that organically, biologically, we are made in such a way that we can't learn except when we make a mistake. And then we decide, that wasn't the right way to go, so we learn from that. Now, the Gemara says the same thing. Ein adam omed al Torah halacha ela im kein nichshal bo tchila. No person can really get straight about halacha until he has stumbled on it. Once you see why it doesn't pay to do it that way and it's necessary to do it the other way, I give you an example and go back to the 70s. Then at the time, a man by the name of Leonard had written a book, Open Marriage. A little bit later he changed his mind and then wrote about the high monogamy. What was happening? The nichshal bo. There was so much karma created at that time. That wasn't such good karma, so we learned from that. So in the same way, we have learned, for instance, that cutting down the challenge of Yiddishkeit and saying, I want to go and lower the standards, that hasn't worked for us. And that if there can't be a growth towards more transformative standards, then it's not going to be. So no one learns without making mistakes. And so the only thing that we can give each other is a brocha, that the mistakes from which you learn should be small ones. And the consequences should not be dire.
and Yehi Ratzon that we should all embody the Psycho-Halachic way. V'nomar Amen. Thank you very much. You were patient and you had this pleasure.
Will you take a couple questions?
Sure.
So, if there may be, this may have stirred up lots of things for people, so we'll leave open a few minutes if there are some questions. If not everyone, as Reb Zalman says, should press the enter button now in their own internal computer, because a lot of material was downloaded to us. Any questions?
Sure.
I'll start. So, in your view, is the halakha like the Constitution where you can amend it all the time? Because I believe that the Lubavitch tradition that you come from does not really see it that way. Which I'm not saying is right or wrong, I'm just asking how you see it.
No, they're not going to say that, because they themselves, have done a lot of amending. If you take a look, some people have, they would want to say they have upward amended, And how do they do that? They would say built into the halachic process are also the tools for updating. And I want to tell you there's some very good people who are doing their renewal, but according to the book still. They haven't quite decided that they want to go and do extra, extra canonical ways of bringing halacha up to date. But they're trying to do that. Years ago, I wrote an article, a long time ago, it was in the 50s, wanted an institute for empirical study of halacha, which meant that all the things that halacha is dealing with, what is the physics of that, what's the chemistry, what makes something kosher, what doesn't make it kosher, and how do you deal with these kinds of things? And in the past, people weren't paying much attention. But now you could see that they have gotten to an understanding of the chemistry, and they have gone upward, that's to say more strict and more strict and more strict. Some of us have felt that not everything has to be that strict. For instance, when it was said that you must watch the milking of a cow to be sure that no pig's milk or no camel's milk or horse's milk is going to be put in there, that was very clear, because there were times when you could expect that they would mix in other animals' milk. Today, with the government having taken over some of these functions, some of us feel you don't have to have Chol of Yisrael, you don't have to have milk that has been supervised by a Jew. You can buy other milk too. And in fact, the Union of Orthodox Congregations of America gives to milk here, Horizon. It's OU, and there's no one standing there watching all the cows that are being milked for Horizon. You know what I'm saying? So some people decide Chabad people will not drink that milk, and some of us will. So this is the kind of thing that happens here.
Yet you still seem like you have a very good relationship with the Chabad people.
Yeah.
Even though you've broken from them so heavily. How do you maintain that that mutual respect?
Well, first of all, I haven't given up learning with them. Learning, not teaching, learning with them. Every Shabbos morning I go over to one of our good Chabad people and spend an hour and a half studying some of those texts. And it's just wonderful. The other day there was a wonderful young man here teaching about meditation at the Millennium. Yeah, Rabbi Vincent. So he came over the next day and we had a long shmuz about Davanology and things that he could use about that, because you know what? 40 years ago, I saw him teaching there, and I saw myself 40 years ago. It was so wonderful. So I'm trying to say, I don't have to cut myself off from that. Now, on the other hand, they're not going to say that I represent their way. But, you know, all the things that I've been teaching here, I could find you tonight. I could find you roots and sources
of that already in that thing. That's what I was saying. I don't want to cut myself off from history and from that kind of organic continuity. But it also means that sometimes the caterpillar has to get into a chrysalis and become a butterfly. Now, would you say that he has a different DNA than he had before? I don't think so. Okay, that's my answer. Another time when I talk to the Chabad people, I say, you guys are regular army, I'm CIA. Okay, anybody else? Please.
You talked about the consensus of the committed, the consensus of the pious. And it seems to me that as communities trying to work towards that, we need some help with consensus building skills.
That's right. And that's the problem that we have is that we don't go out. Take a look. The evangelicals are going out and they're knocking on doors. And if you haven't yet met two young men coming in from the Mormons knocking on your door and telling you about the Latter-day Saints and so on and so forth, they do that. How come that we, who have a better product than any of the others, keep it so much to ourselves? So consensus building happens when you have a potluck supper, for instance, at the shul, and people bring in all kinds of things. And the question is now, what are the limits of what they can bring in? So you build consensus. In this shul, on these tables with these dishes, this is the only thing you can bring in. So you see, we are doing some of it, but we don't do enough outreach.
Well, so I'm going to suggest that as a topic for future talk.
Thank you.
Jewish, from the tradition, what are our consensus building skills that we have?
Hey, good, wonderful. What else?
I would like to go with your suggestions.
Yes.
And add on to that the commitments, the kinds of consensus building community which has the commitments and defining those commitments as a part of a consensus building community. Because having lived in Israel for 30 years and coming back to the United States, it's as a Jew, as a woman, a Jewish woman, it's very different than when I left 30 years ago. And I'm not clear on the consensus building. I am very observant in the fact there are many different kinds of ways in which people define themselves as Jews, and I'm not sure that that's derived from a core organic commitment that later blossoms from the same root source. I don't know.
Let me respond short on this, and we'll still keep it for the other time, for the long one. But in the short, I want to say this. The Chavurah is a way of building consensus. And that's such a wonderful thing whenever we have had our people together building a Chavurah. I looked at the 13 tribe Chavurah. What a wonderful thing it is for these people who have a different sexual orientation to be able to feel free with each other, to talk to each other, and they create a consensus. And the interesting thing is how that consensus also demands a certain kind of ethic, how to behave in that setting. It's not the same consensus, let's say, that a heterosexual group will have. But nevertheless, they build consensus. Now the question is how wide the consensus is being built. Now in some families, you can have a situation where there is a consensual approach to their Yiddishkeit, and some of them will have a very dictatorial way of doing it. So that's not so good. But Chavurot are that kind of thing. And I'll tell you a sad thing. When Isaac Mayer Wise, who came from Europe to build in Cincinnati the Reform movement and the Reform Seminary and so on, he went around to a bunch of wholesalers and asked them to close their stores, their business on Shabbos. And he had gotten all but one to agree. And that one didn't agree, and that broke the consensus of the others. And if you can imagine, if that person would have agreed, just in your imagination, then Cincinnati and the Reform movement would have had a different flavor, you know? And everything else would have come out along from there. So I think this is the idea. We are, after the Holocaust, it is so hard to build the consensus for us. So what have they done? We've created enclaves. So the Satmara have their consensus, and within that consensus, don't you dare to deviate, you know? And all the other Hasidim have their consensus. And when I go back to the Chabad people, they have the least hard lines because their outreach situation is that they want to be Mekarev people. Yeah? So they will accept people who are living outside of the consensus, saying, today they're outside of this group, but tomorrow maybe that. Put on film one time, light candles and so on and so forth. This is how they go about doing that. But consensus is slow building. You know, what can I say? The people who are more on the mother frame than on the father frame have trouble with consensus. If the Democrats would have had enough more consensus, oi, you know? So it takes time. This is, it's almost like saying, Mashiach isn't here yet. Okay, I'll take one more.
This is such a basic question. I've been trying to figure what you meant by Psycho-Halakhah and the name of the talk. And I wondered what that meant to you, because all this poured out of it. What does Psycho-Halakhah mean?
Well, if it is merely halacha, to say this is the law, and it does not have any impact on your psychological and your inner life, then it's only halacha, not psycho-halakhah. Okay. And the way in which I want to deal with this is that it should have the transformative stuff built in. That's why I use the word psycho, you know, because all the other things could be, if it doesn't have a psychological impact on you, what you're doing, then it will not be transformative. Now, then you may say, on which level of psychology? So I say behaviorism is one level, you know, depth psychology is another one, humanistic is another one, transpersonal is another, but all these levels, that's what I mean when I'm saying the Psycho-Halachic is a four-world thing, so it brings us back to four-world daven and four-world doing. That's what I mean by it, okay? All right, anyone else? Okay, you want to say something else?
In Hebrew, there's a root here that is lalechet, is to walk. So it's you can take the gerund, it's a walking. And again, come back to this whole idea of coming back to the United States. The path is what I'm trying to figure out. Yeah. The walking, I get. Halacha, I get. I know that it exists, and there's a way in which to reframe it, work with the cycle part of it. It's the path.
That's true, and it's a process. It also has the sense of process, and you move through it. It isn't a static thing. That's really what's there. And at the same time, you could also call about embodied or ensouled halacha. All of these would be good ways of saying that. Embodied halacha, you get a different sense than if you say just halacha. And if you say ensouled halacha and what's the word that you when you talk about Buddhism being engaged halacha, all of these would go. But that's what, for me, Psycho-Halakhah is the word. Have a good night. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Reb Zalman. In Reb Zalman's book, the beginning, the introduction says, Shwer zu seine Yid. Our parents' generation used to say it's hard to be a Jew. But we Jews living today are lucky. Being Jewish is safer now than any time in our history. Our challenge today is to be Jewish in a way that fills our lives with meaning. We want to be Jewish with awareness, to do Jewish in a way that satisfies our soul. We want our Yiddishkeit to enrich the world in which we live. And I think that's one embodiment or one lens of Psycho-Halakhah.
Amen.
And lastly, for Reb Zalman, the last chapter in this book is called The Final Blessing, and it says, one of the greatest needs this planet has for healing is blessing. It is under-blessed. Under-blessed reality is like empty calories. So what I want to say is, Reb Zalman, we give you a blessing that you may have the nachas of the joys of having written this book and for living in Boulder. We're grateful and wish you many years of good and healthy life, you and Chavala.
Amen. And I thank you all because you didn't yawn, you didn't fall asleep on me, and it was tough going and you stayed with me. Thank you, thank you.